Why were the Japanese so brutal in World War II? Japan is known as the land of anime, sushi, and sumo. Today, when outsiders think of Japan, the first thoughts that come to mind are probably Godzilla, impeccable politeness, and technological innovation. In the last century, however, there was a different, far darker reputation garnered by the land of the rising sun. What caused this infamous reputation for cruelty? Bushido. The explanation has its roots that go back for centuries. Japan was a patchwork of feudal states which were in a near-constant state of war, reaching its height during the Sengoku Jidai period, which began in the mid-15th century, ending in 1603 with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate. With the endless fighting, tremendous cultural emphasis was placed on the warrior class, the samurai. During the stability of the Tokugawa shogunate, this cultural attitude was formalized into a warrior's moral code of conduct called Bushido, which means way of the warrior. Bushido changed in its tenets over the centuries, but some of the main principles, such as self-sacrifice, reckless bravery in the face of the enemy, and unquestioning loyalty to one's daimyo, or lord, never changed. The age of the samurai ended after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. The once strict social classes of the previous eras were eliminated, and Japan underwent rapid industrialization after centuries of isolation. Bushido was readopted for the modern age, with Emperor Hirohito and his military officers being substituted for the shogun and daimyo, its teachings dominating actions before and during the Second World War. Japan began to modernize rapidly, using Western industrial, technological, and military innovations, and the Bushido Code was adapted to fit into the modern landscape. In the years before the outbreak of war, the Japanese school system had fully embraced the regimented militarism of Bushido. Students were indoctrinated into a system of unrelenting discipline that emphasized obedience to authority as the highest of virtues. This would be enforced by cruel methods, such as being beaten by their teachers, struck with canes or wooden swords, being forced to run laps until dropping from exhaustion, or hold heavy objects on outstretched hands, and whatever else their instructors could come up with. This type of indoctrination led to a generation who had unflinching loyalty to their emperor and their superiors, and they would obey without question. No retreat, no surrender. Perhaps the most infamous aspect of Japanese culture during this time was the willingness to fight to the bitter end. According to their view on warfare, surrendering was an unbearable disgrace, a mark of shame for any fighting man. When other armies would see the futility of fighting and give up, the Japanese military would keep fighting, regardless of the casualties. For comparison, for every Allied soldier taken captive in World War II, 3 would be killed on the battlefield, while the Japanese military would suffer 120 dead for every one of its soldiers taken captive. Often, they would resort to banzai charges, hurling themselves at the enemy rather than surrender. This was named after their battle cry, Tennoheika Banzai, roughly translated as "Long live the Emperor." One of the most famous banzai charges happened on July 6, 1944 on Saipan. After 3 weeks of battle, the Americans had captured much of the island and were closing the noose on the remaining Japanese defenders. Rather than surrender, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu, the commanding officer, committed seppuku, or ritual suicide, in the face of his failure, another samurai tradition. The remaining men and officers, as well as many civilians, then threw themselves with reckless abandon at the American lines, hoping to kill as many soldiers before being killed in the fierce fighting that ensued, much of it in desperate hand-to-hand combat. For the next 12 hours, they rampaged around the island, overrunning several American positions before the bitter end. It was estimated that around 4,300 Japanese soldiers died this way rather than surrender, the largest banzai attack of the war. They weren't alone in their fanatical defiance. Hundreds of civilians threw themselves off of cliff sides rather than allow themselves to be captured by the horrified Americans. While this was the largest banzai attack of the war, they would be repeated over and over again during the island-hopping campaign. any survivors committing seppuku, preferring death to capture. Many Japanese soldiers would also fake surrendering, then drop a grenade or pull a pistol on American soldiers that had dropped their guard. After several of these incidents, the Americans, for the most part, stopped believing attempts at surrender, simply shooting the supposedly surrendering soldier rather than take the risk. The most extreme example of this attitude of never surrendering was the kamikaze, translated as divine wind. These were pilots who would deliberately crash their planes into enemy ships as a last-ditch, desperate attempt to halt their inexorable advance on the Japanese homeland. These pilots were sent on a one-way mission to damage as much enemy naval strength as possible. Kamikaze attacks reached their peak in 1945 at the Battle of Okinawa, the last stepping stone before Japan itself. Swarms of these fanatical pilots struck the American fleet, killing over 5,000, the largest loss of life the U.S. Navy suffered in a single battle. Even with their Pacific Empire in ruins, the Japanese nation would not give in, even resorting to handing out bamboo spears to school children. During planning for the invasion, the American military was expecting to have to fight the majority of the population. In anticipation of Operation Downfall, estimates of potential Allied casualties reached as high as 1 million, and 500,000 Purple Hearts were produced, a number so high that these original medals are still being given out today. Don't get taken prisoner. Since the very concept of surrendering was inconceivable to the Japanese military mindset, they had nothing but contempt for enemy combatants that laid down their weapons. These men had given up their honor, and in an honor-bound society, these made POWs the lowest of the low. Compounding this was Japan's attitude towards the Geneva Convention, which governed the treatment of POWs. Japan did sign the convention, but failed to ratify it. As a result, they didn't abide by its tenets, with some officers derisively calling it the Coward's Code. So when Allied troops surrendered, such as when 80,000 British, Indian, Malaysian, and Australian soldiers gave up in 1942 at the fall of Singapore, they were taken aback. How could any self-respecting fighting man give up so easily? As they had no honor, the prisoners were treated as animals with little regard for their well-being. Forced to work at doing hard labor, they were deliberately starved, beaten, and executed for the slightest of infractions. They could be used for bayonet practice or decapitated with an officer's swords on a whim. Because of this treatment, the death rate among POWs was appallingly high. For comparison, the death rate for an Allied soldier in a German POW camp was about 1.2%. Those unfortunate enough to be taken by the Japanese suffered a death rate as high as 37%. The treatment of civilians. This blatant disregard for human life also encompassed civilians as well. In addition to their form of Bushido, the Japanese also held deeply xenophobic views towards outsiders, especially the Chinese. As early as 1931, Japan began to encroach on Chinese territory, which erupted into the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. In December of that year, the Japanese army captured the city of Nanking. During the next 2 months, the population was systematically subject to one of the most brutal sackings in history. Estimates vary, but between 100 and 300,000 Chinese civilians were killed, with countless incidents of torture, assault, and murders committed. At one point, a pair of Japanese officers competed with one another to see who could decapitate 100 Chinese the fastest, though they exceeded this number by murdering 106 and 105 respectively. By far, the most horrifying aspect of this disregard for human life was Unit 731, short for Manchu Detachment 731, a chemical and biological warfare research team. This unit of the Imperial Japanese Army performed experiments on captive prisoners, mostly Chinese and Korean subjects. The prisoners would be infected with various diseases to document the disease's progress. Limbs would be hacked off and organs would be removed while the victim was still alive, to determine the progress of the disease still in living tissue. Weapons would also be tested on living subjects, including guns, knives, bayonets, explosives like grenades, flamethrowers, and anything else in the Japanese arsenal would be used on the captives. The effectiveness jotted down for study. These are just a few of the horrors that Unit 731 inflicted on the defenseless. After the war, the Japanese government and people distanced themselves as much as possible from the fanaticism of the mid-20th century. With pacifism written into their constitution, Japanese culture has shifted, now focusing much more on technological advancement and connection with the outside world. A 180-degree change from their past.